Hello anchor test fans, it's Steve with SV Panopé. We're back on the water with a different boat and some new crew members. I switched boats here because I'm responding to some direct criticism of a previous test of a Fortress 10-pound FX16 anchor. Among those criticisms were that I was using too large a boat. Panopé weighs 15,000 pounds and this boat weighs maybe about 3,500 pounds. Also, it was suggested that I was using not enough scope, and what I've done is I've increased scope from 3.5 to 1 to 5 to 1. Another thing that was criticized was that the camera buoyancy may have been affecting the setting of the anchor, and what we've done was we've measured the buoyancy. It's 11 ounces. We've got 11 ounces pulling up on that shank, and I don't think that's really an issue. That initial set was perfect, by the way. We're in my normal sandy mud bottom site. Again, we are using 5 to 1 scope. It's a mixed rode. We've got 12 feet of 5/16 chain, and the balance is 9/16 rope. And you'll see that initial reset, the anchor did a backflip. It got flipped up and over backwards, and we'll watch that again in slow motion and analyze this a little bit. See the chain whizzing by there. And remember, there's lots of nylon in this rode, so there's going to be some rubber band action. You notice that it kind of stopped momentarily. The boat didn't stop, but the chain did, and now it's going to get violently flipped up over backwards. Take some of that spring taken out of the line. Now notice right here we've stopped. The tethers are not yet touching the flukes. Tethers are not a factor. They're not causing that fluke to not pivot. The reason the fluke's not pivoting is because it's packed with seabed, and also I believe there's dynamic pressure. The water is pushing on the underside of those flukes, and eventually you'll see enough of that seabed gets washed away, and then the boat slows down enough that the flukes will pivot, but it takes a while. If the boat was going slower, there'd be less washing action, but there'd be less dynamic pressure. So I'm not sure if going slower would help it or make the situation worse. Right now the camera tether lines are just laying against the fluke. I've simulated this on the floor in my shop, and I cannot in any way cause those flukes to not pivot with those camera tethers, and the assertion that those are causing the flukes to not pivot it's just false. It's just not accurate. The flukes were jammed with seabed, and or dynamic pressure was preventing them from pivoting down. They did pivot halfway down. You'll see they're basically laying on the substrate, but it's still not, they haven't pivoted fully. The boat's just sort of drifting along. I've cut the power, and it never did set. I never had any indication that it was going to set on that pull. Here's the second attempt. So the boat passed over in my normal manner, 3.5 knots, and this time the anchor did connect with the bottom. It's hooked up. I've added some power. I don't know how much power I'm pulling or how much thrust. Let's say it's 200 or 300 pounds. It's a 90 horse engine, but we're just using a little more than idle, never using full power or anywhere close to it. Here's the third reset. We're feeling violent, well, not violent, but very pronounced lurching through the boat. And what you can see is the anchor is upright, pivoted correctly. Fluke tips are trying to dig in, but they just can't quite dig in fully, and the boat lurches, and then it pops it out, and then it tries again. If the anchor was clean, maybe it would dig in. Very difficult to test that, whether or not it would. I've used this anchor when it was clean and deployed it underway. You'll remember from my emergency stop test previously of this anchor, I deployed it at 3.6 knots, did not slow the boat down, and as soon as it touched the ground, it just dug right in. So I believe fouling was perhaps an issue with that failure to reset. Here is the fourth attempt. Again, I'm just driving the boat back and forth directly up over the anchor at 3.5 knots on every one of these resets. And that was just about textbook. We didn't see much, but the anchor appeared to remain buried, rotate, and then stop the boat, and holds the power set power that I've chosen. I'm thinking maybe that's about 300 pounds of thrust. Here's the fifth reset. Didn't see much, but boy, the anchor didn't hardly move at all. I'm assuming that the anchor rotated in the seabed as it should, and if the anchor did that every single time, this would be a real reliable anchor to let your boat swing on, and you could sleep soundly, but it just doesn't do that every time. Sometimes it pivots and holds. Other times, as in this 6th attempt, it seemed to pivot okay. It didn't flip over backwards, but it pulled out enough to then start dragging. And once again, it doesn't really want to reset until things get really, really slow. In fact, on this one, it does not reset. The assumption is that the seabed blob that you can kind of see there just for a second is preventing the tips from digging in. Here's the 7th reset. We feel a few lurches, 2 or 3 of them, and then we feel one last big lurch, and the anchor sets perfectly, and we power set it and it no longer moves. Here's the 8th reset. You see the chain, it hit the camera. We get another backflip. Once again, the tethers are just laying alongside the fluke. I cannot imagine that the tether is preventing the flukes from pivot. We see seabed washing away right now. Eventually, that seabed washes away enough, and the boat slows down enough that the flukes will pivot. There, I've stopped the motion just so you can see the tether streaming forward up alongside the shank. The anchor isn't rotating upside down, it's just the camera rotating. And here I've slowed down. The camera is rising. All the seabed has washed away. The flukes eventually pivot, and I think I chopped the power right there, and I believe it would have set. If I would have kept pulling on a little bit, the anchor would have set after that drag. Here's the 9th attempt. That was a very solid stopping of the boat. Power sets, holding great. 10th reset. Another backflip. Again, flukes are not allowed to pivot. Again, I do not believe that the tethers could possibly be the culprit. They're just laying alongside, and one is right in the middle, but sure enough, the sediment is being washed away. There's one last little clump there, but there it goes. Now it's completely clean, and the only thing holding the flukes up is dynamic pressure of the water going by. And once again, once the boat slows down enough, flukes will pivot. The tether isn't affecting that at all. You'll see the tether just floats away here in a minute. Pivot down, and again, I didn't know what was going on when I was doing this test, so I just cut the power and didn't have any reason to believe it would then set. I think if I would have put a little more power, it would have reset. And indeed, that last attempt there at the 180-degree reset, it hooks up just great. So I'm trying to retrieve the anchor now by hand, and I cannot. It's dug in too deeply, and there's no windlass on this boat. I'm just pulling directly upward by hand, and there's no way I can unset the anchor. So I cleat it off, and we just idle the boat ahead real slow, and that's all you need to do. It pulls the anchor out just fine. We'll get a look at the sediment, and sure enough, there's a pretty healthy blob of stuff on there. So I mentioned those criticisms that I received, and the last criticism that I'm going to address is that I was comparing this 10-pound anchor with much larger anchors, and that maybe small anchors just can't cope with resetting as well. So okay, what I did though is I came up with another anchor, and here it is.
Same crew, although we're colder, and it is a 5-kilogram Bruce. You're fine.
So it's a genuine Bruce anchor. It's hardly been used. You see that yellow flag on the side there? That's actually the original factory labeling. So this is virtually a brand new, genuine 5-kilogram or 11-pound Bruce anchor. Here's the initial set from a 2-knot back down. I'm actually going forward when I'm doing all these testings with this boat. And it set immediately. You see it hardly moved, maybe half an anchor length. But then when I add some power of maybe 300 pounds, Away she goes. And this anchor does this continuously. We're feeling some lurches. It's really incredible. This anchor just attacks the ground. It wants to set, but it has very low holding power. Here's a reset. Anchor pivots. It initially holds the boat for an instant. We feel lurching, but it has such low holding power that it cannot hold against even a quarter throttle with this engine. But its reset performance is consistent and perfect. It always tries real hard, and every time it digs in halfway, like these Bruce anchors do, it never dives into the seabed and it never makes much holding power, but it's always setting. I don't see any fouling issues with it. We're feeling great lurches. There it stopped the boat, then add power, and it just cannot hold much at all. And it's amazing. It's virtually identical to the larger Bruces I've tested in that they set and reset very reliably, but they just don't make much holding power. I do this back and forth quite a few times, and there's just no variation. Every single time the anchor gallantly tries to reset, and it does reset with very low holding power. So I hope I've addressed some of these issues. Again, I was asked that, or told that perhaps I was using too large a boat with Panopay, so we've got a small boat. I was told that perhaps the scope wasn't enough, so I increased scope with the Fortress anchor up to its recommended 5:1 scope. I verified that the camera buoyancy is extremely light. It's only 11 ounces of buoyancy. I've shown that the camera tether is not affecting the pivoting action of the fluke, or really anything with the action of the anchor. And now I've compared the Fortress to an anchor that's exactly the same weight. Well, it's 1 pound heavier. And this non-pivoting claw anchor it's clear to me that it's a better resetting anchor. It's more reliable. It doesn't make nearly the power. There's no question that a Fortress or any Danforth style anchor, when they're set, will create far more holding power than a Bruce anchor or pretty much any anchor in the world. I still believe they're perhaps the highest holding power per weight anchor that you can buy. But in terms of resetting, I have to stand by my earlier conclusion that a Danforth or Fortress anchor may not be the best choice for a bow permanent swinging type anchor. I say this because there are many other anchors, and I've tested 4 of them, that have been 100% on my reset test. And I think that test, although rare, I think that test will have some applicability in the real world. So I'll close with a 6th and final criticism that I received, and that is that I am not a scientist. But for this test, at least, we did have a scientist on board. In the lower right there, that's my beloved father. He is the world's foremost geoduck researcher. He spent many decades, it was his life's work, studying these geoduck creatures that live in this very substrate that we're testing in, and perhaps no one understands this environment more than him. He's been a lifetime boater, and he's taught me much of what I know. So I hope his presence on board, although it was certainly fun for us to do this together, I hope he's added some credibility as well. That's all for now. So long.